Hey there, eVTOL fan. Great to see you. I think we're both fired up about this one here, one of our favorite topics, probably mostly of recently, but there's been so much exciting news over time with Joby and their defense side of things. Yeah, looking forward to this conversation. What anything in particular you're excited to touch on?
Well, I can't. Ahead of Joby right now is that amazing story of the Air Force colonel who was rescued. So I know we're talking about defense, and it sort of brings it all home. And especially when you think about the kind of rescue mission and operation, and some of this advanced technology that Joby's developing, other companies are developing. The defense tech space is really interesting, and there's a lot of great minds that have worked on ideas that could help our warfighters keep the peace or bring the violence when it's necessary. In this case, I think we've all thought of a little bit about, hey, what would the Joby defense case or use case be? An autonomous pilot that could go in behind enemy lines quietly and pick up a person was something I kept thinking about. I don't know about you.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. Thankfully, everything was squared away with, obviously the pilots, but also, it shows some of the capabilities that, this is the world can be a dangerous place, right? And you need this very particular tools to be able to help you with that. And, I think there was a lot of interest, as much information as they're going to share with us, but, some things about special communications links, which was interesting because that kind of touched on the AST stuff that, Arna, our good friend, so closely, but then also in particular, counter UAS things, because they were also looking for it, the other side was looking for them as well. And those are some things that I think we can touch on in this deep dive that, even Jobin was able to elaborate a little bit further on the, incredible episode that he just did with Joe Lonsdale on American Optimist, the second iteration of that interview. But yeah, I think we can kind of kick this off or start out with kind of some things from the very beginning of where all this started with Joby, the defense side of things, because I think obviously it's a much deeper story. I think both of us believe than Joby gets credit for, and it's something that it goes back quite a bit of time. So we'll jump right in here. I'm gonna just touch on this and we can kind of pull this thread. My goal here, I think, is, we've been following this for quite a bit of time, and some of the things that are, nestled behind kind of the days of the SPAC and when a little bit more attention happened that we can elaborate on. So I'm really looking forward to pulling some of these deeper threads here with you. Without further ado, this is something that, it seems kind of small, a piece of the puzzle, but when you see what Joby has done from, quite a bit of time, this is from 2012, where they are partnered with NASA, and this is just some of their, initial, you see how far they've come, some of these initial propulsion systems and how they were, configuring their blades and then the cells. I mean, there's some early renderings of the original Joby designs, I guess, so to speak. I think those were, necessarily called the S2, but there's, it's almost like 15 blades, or, it's quite a heavier configuration of blades and nacelles. But these are the things that I think are sometimes missed. Moreover, if you see what's mentioned here, that some of the technology that was in and a part of this program was used on X-57. These are just some of these kind of interesting military programs that have popped up over time. But anything else that people aren't familiar with in terms of kind of timeline for Joby here? Give me 1 second. So this was in 2020. Another piece, I think this was probably where we can jump in a little bit further, where things really got serious when they got airworthiness for 542 Alpha Juliet. That was a workhorse. Maybe we can actually, it's a good moment. We can show a picture that I sent to you recently offline, about some of the testing that they did with 542 Alpha Juliet, and in particular, and the configuration, of the aircraft. So let me see if I can get this up here. Perfect. So just for everybody to kind of notice something that you only see. This is the only time that this configuration, not this picture, but on this particular aircraft, 542 Alpha Juliet, you'll notice that there's retractable landing gear. Now, obviously, would be an incredible piece of the puzzle for the defense side of things, just based off of what you could do acoustically, get through, radar and other sensors, components that they're trying to obviously focus on with counter-UAS and other things. Obviously, there is an aerodynamic, penalty per se when those things are out. Just, have to be a, aerospace engineer to understand that about what we're looking at here. But obviously, Joby has also elaborated on the Joe Lonsdale podcast, one of the top aerodynamicists, and he was talking about Gregor.
Yeah.
Maybe understand that. Anyway, let's just kind of dig in from there.
Yeah, it sounds good. I guess just one real quick thing too is it's Joby's history with access to the military or defense or some of those things kind of predates, I think, when Joe Ben was in college. Some of the things that the government did, like DARPA challenges that had fostered robotics, sort of led to one thing. There's a lot of people that connected through that. What was it? Joe Ben had that business where it was Joby Energy. That was where the propeller technology came, and then sort of one thing led to the other. So it's also interesting to just sort of note the connections between all these things and how important the investment by the government has been in transformative technology. When you look at all the things that came out of the space program or, a Manhattan Project, blah, 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 there, sort of people get used to hearing that, but it's really true. It brings people together who it funds initial seed capital. It creates a lot of like wild ideas. And then fast forward, dozen years and you have the S4 flying around.
Yeah, you make all these good points, and maybe we can get to our agenda here. There's so much to dig into on Joby Defense, but we'll kind of stick with it. So from the angle of just talking about, obviously a huge piece of the Joby story, and most recently, you had put a great post up about the new simulator, but the work behind that simulator, it's impressive in and of its own. But to think about all of the, initial flight simulator time that's had to be done, outside of, just the computers themselves, or, having AI systems now that are running simulations, but, actual inputs from pilots flying, that was, DOD, sometimes, there was some Air Force and NASA pilots that have been known, to be a part of that program. And I'll pull up some photos there. But when you think about that long story where you had some of the first work that Joby was doing was in 2012, most people have, they can't really even understand that this was an idea back then. But then, now to think about where we've come through to see the simulator in Marina delivered, where they're, people are posting about it online openly, and obviously Joby would need to be okay with that. So just curious what seen over time and where you think maybe this is an edge. I mean, you don't really see a lot broadly around simulators to this extent outside of Joby.
Yeah, I think it speaks to two things. Joby thinking, 2 steps ahead, 3 steps, 4 steps, 2 years in this case, to be able to have that ready. And then also to think about the ecosystem needing to build the the pilot pool. And, from what Joe Ben said, it sounds like, there's a constraint. However, you then see sort of how deep they're thinking about that with Bonnie Simi talking about how this is a great path for pilots who don't want to work the usual grind of a big airplane. You can work like 9 to 5 and you can be home, you can live in your own community. You might want to downshift. And even I think there was talk about using this as a training program to build more capable pilots who could then go do larger planes and things like that. So I think the moat piece of it is also really interesting. The fact that if you don't hear about another OEM ordering their flight simulator, then they're either planning not to have pilots or have some other clever solution, right? Because you're going to need to have this SFAR was pretty clear, right, about how there's room for potential innovation, whether it's VR goggles and things like that. The FAA said that they would be open to evidence-based kind of rule changes. But, otherwise, you're going to need a level 6 and a level 7. And I think Joby has the level 7, which is for helicopters, and then the level 6 is the one that's like airplane grade. And I don't know the distinctions, like can you be trained on the 7 and the 6 and how they're planning to use both. But they have another one coming too.
Yeah, no, the just in terms of that distinction, as far as I'm understanding at this point, the current simulator is a you know, conforming everything ready for pilots. The next is the full motion simulator, where the actual structure, the photos that you posted, it's kind of just looks like a big orb. The full motion will actually move. So yeah, it just speaks to this is a picture they pulled up here, and this is actually in the marina facility. I've seen this simulator, but this is back in 2023. NASA pilots, and this is an advanced version of their simulator, and I think it's a pretty important distinction. Is the simulator itself is being fed by real world data. Yeah, you could use some engine like similar to a video game, but this is not the real deal. Understanding the aerodynamics, all the unique challenges of different design choices, etc. And this simulator in particular is something that back even in 2023 Joby was extremely advanced with, and again that was through their work with CAE. But they can also only do that because at this point in time we'd have to go back and look, but by 2023 they had probably already reached somewhere in the neighborhood of 20 or 30,000 miles that had been flown on the S4, and obviously that's an incredible amount of data. Eric Allison has talked about that in a couple of different interviews, where they've got more data than they need. So it's really finding these unique moments of the flight path or different things they're doing. But yeah, I think just the amount of time that has been both invested in the simulator component of things, obviously all through the military work. Those were the first pilots, even the current pilots, Buddy Denham, of course. Also Andrea is one of the more recent ones, Italian, but came from the military side as well. So you just see it throughout all of these different pilots that they've worked with. But it's something that I think, as also Bonnie Simi has talked about at length, and it's what you mentioned about just some of the quality of life. And they're thinking, they're not just thinking into the future. The amount of 3D chess that they're doing, understanding that there's going to be a pilot shortage, so they've invested heavily into autonomy, arguably tip of the spear there as well with their super pilot technology, but then also into the investment of the pilots themselves. Right, it's just like moving from helicopters to eVTOL aircraft. There is not a on Sunday it doesn't exist. One exists and the other doesn't, and then on Monday it flips. That it just won't be that way, and that phase in, I think, is what's so crucial about these pilots.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Joby's pretty clever about things. I think they set up the flight school as like a community benefit organization, and I think that I'm not 100% sure on all the advantages, but I think there's some tax if you're not going to monetize it, and I don't think that they would, because they're going to just benefit from the pilots. Then I think there's a good tax angle, and you can get grants and things like that. And I just wanted to clear up that they're getting a level C. That's the full motion one that you were talking about, Travis. And they have a 7, and essentially you have to have a simulator if you have a part for your part 135. So if you have a part 135 and you don't have a simulator, no bueno.
It's just a piece of paper. And I think something else that's important is the distinction and more, I think part of the catalyst of this conversation is Joby's thought of a lot is to just be from the air taxi side of things. Joby has said multiple times, Paul Sciarra has reiterated it, Joe Ben has reiterated it, that Joby will sell aircraft in certain circumstances based off geographic things where the operator needs to own the aircraft or whatever that might be, more in maybe Dubai or Saudi Arabia. But moreover, they're going to be selling these things for sure to the military. The military's already been paying them for these aircraft. And the S4, Joby sent 2 of them to Edwards Air Force Base, so that was 5421 Alpha, and then the 542 X-ray. But, when you think about them selling their aircraft, it's something that Rodrigo, the new CFO, talked about on the last call and reiterated it, and something that Bonnie did as well, is outside of running the air taxi service, outside of mRNO servicing the aircraft, etc., in order to sell the aircraft, even if you don't plan to operate it, if you have to sell it, if you're going to sell it, you need a simulator. And I think that's, if you know, and that is going to be something very particular, right? You could have, let's call it an order book that has all sorts of, numbers listed for number of aircraft, potential revenue, etc. But even if you built them, if you don't have a simulator, you can't sell them. And so I think that this is something also, just a differentiator for Joby. I think you used the term moat, and, there's more, there's becoming more and more rings in the moat as the days go by. But yeah, no, I think the simulators are such a crucial piece, and we can't really highlight the importance of that enough, because it's the quiet thing that you don't hear about, but then it's the thing that can't be shortcutted. You can't go back unless you have a time machine.
I know we're beating a dead horse, but I just want to pile on some more on that topic, because I think it's important to know that Joby started working with CAE in 2022. So that's 5 years ago. They put the order in 2 years ago. So it doesn't mean you just show up and you order your flight simulator. There's a lot of work that apparently has to go in order to do that. And they had to have been in probably a pretty good place with their plane to understand the physics, to have all the data, to have CAE start building it. I'm sure you can modify these things. I don't know if it's as easy as software upload or something like that, but I don't know how many. They probably had 30,000 miles of flying with the S4. The main concept of what the S4 is, not the conforming one today. So those are also important things too. It's like you got to have your ducks in order, and when you start being able to settle your plane, then you can start getting all the other pieces in place. And if you want to move fast, you have to do them all at the same time, and that's very hard to do unless you have a strong management team and a great design.
100%. And I think it's also, when you look at the decisions that they've made over time, Joby has been, because of their execution up to this point, they haven't had to have issues of funding or chasing funding. And so they've been very methodical with how they've invested. Right. So as you just pointed out, they knew, because of, the experience of the entire team, but in particular, Bonnie Simi, that this was a long tail. And so, from the beginning was, the amount of data that was being pulled off of these aircraft. Joby's been flying these aircraft for quite a bit of time. So obviously over 50,000 miles flown. So when you just think about the foresight of that, even with the S4 technology, with Joby's geeks, charging, if you wanted to just go today and say, hey, here's the aircraft, go fly 50,000 miles, the amount of time that would take, just to charge and do, this is years and years of real world work that's been, tied in the hardware side, and then tied into the software side. So I think, it feels like beating a dead horse, but this is going to be a differentiator. This picture that we're looking at right here on the screen that you highlighted, people should check out. I guess it's on LinkedIn, this post, but highlighting this, I think this picture probably stuns a lot of people, because at least even for me, it made it very real. That is a big simulator. It's as tall as some things hover, so some people can only hover that tall, that high. And Joby, their simulator is that tall. So this is pretty significant. More to come from it, because as a huge contributor to the Joby side of things, since it's a deep dive, we'll shout out where people can find information too. But the Joby subreddit is an incredible resource. Dad on there leads that, and he recently had a tour, got rewarded for his great research and promotion. And that was something that he had talked about in the midst of his visit, was seeing this simulator that's on the screen, but then also the location for the other one right next to it, planned and set up, which would probably tell you Joby typically does things on delay, or at least announcing them. So they'll probably have that. They've just guided that it would be for the end of the year for the level C that you talked about. I would guess that for all their other plans with Electric Skies Tour, how excited, Jobin was. That was one of the more forthcoming, and I think kind of he almost had a bit of kind of giddiness of how excited that he was. You could tell. I mean, this has been a dream his entire life, and really how far in advance they are with the flight program. So, you have anything else that you wanted to highlight here of just the simulator work, which obviously starts back at the beginning with these military pilots that are crucial to the development?
It just looks like a thing that would be built in a clean room, like those NASA spaceships with, everyone walking in. So, and that's probably some of the enthusiasm on the CAE side, that they look so excited to take a picture in front of something they've probably seen every single day for a year or however long it takes to build. But yeah, so I feel like this is the boring stuff, and now we're going to get to the good stuff, talking about, some of the more practical things that Joby's doing with defense versus some of the potential. So I'm excited to kind of get into that too, and I don't know where you want to start first.
Yeah, I mean, I think from here, just kind of set this up a bit. So, next up, I think it's a crucial piece, right? Maybe if people don't have as much context, to this story, because it is such, it's been such a robust story over all the years. But the biggest thing, the proof of the pudding, is anybody knows in this space. There's been some interesting things about when these aircraft, eVTOL in particular, people talk about their defense contracts or programs that they've been working with the military and touting those. And I think it's what's really important, amidst all of that, because I was, even broadly speaking, people understand government contracts and things take a long time. It's really slow moving. This is not an agile thing. And, to see that Joby is the only manufacturer of eVTOL that has delivered these aircraft actually to military bases, and that's at Edwards Air Force Base. And both of those aircraft have been flown, tested. We've seen both piloted and remote flight down at the Edwards base. So when you talk about what really matters in and around Joby Defense, like how can we sit here and talk about, hey, we're going to do a deep dive on this? Well, unless you have an aircraft, in this case two, and that's two that they publicly acknowledge. There's some neat clues out there about maybe other platforms that they're working on. But when you think about these two aircraft, the amount of information that has been gathered between these two teams from both flying these aircraft, servicing these aircraft. Obviously, if you are going to use these in the field, they're going to need unique charging systems. So what does that look like, right? Do you have a really powerful mini geeks that, that has somehow the same power or is able to leverage battery systems for something like me? Who knows what the special projects team at Joby is cooking up? But I think we can kind of just start with these two S4s that were delivered to Edwards Air Force Base, and I will just put in the background. Hopefully, it won't be distracting, and I'll give you the floor. But this was a video you shared, which is the delivery ceremony for that first aircraft. So this would be Paul Sciarra delivering the first eVTOL ever, not just from Joby, to the Department of War, and this is at Edwards Air Force Base. So I'll give you the floor, and we'll let her rip.
Yeah, so I think the AFWERX contract that Joby got to deliver, to basically use their planes to start to see how operational testing would work. And there was a lot of discussion around on-base kind of activities, like could you take someone from one side of the base to the other, and just like simple electric taxi hops like that. There was the Marine Corps, I think in 2023, they talked about, medical response. And we kind of touched on that just briefly in the beginning of the show. But it seemed to be an area where they were really interested in logistics. And then I think some distinguishing things. So I think Joby's the only eVTOL operator in the US to actually be on base. Is that fair to say? So there's also been talk about all the contract values and things like that. And I think it's important to know, like, they're all the AFWERX contracts sort of had a up to limit. And then, it was very unclear how much money was actually doled out to the different, OEMs. And so I think Joby achieved the highest percentage of that total contract value. And I think that to me was one reason why I really started to follow Joby and feel like they were going to be able to put all of this complexity together and deliver on the promise of, you know, electric flight, vertical takeoff and landing. Is that they kept getting more, they kept doing more with the government. And then, I don't think it's been perfect. So there was also the opportunity after Edwards to take two planes to MacDill Air Force Base. And we haven't really heard officially like what happened there. So you never know, maybe they are there, maybe they're not, and maybe Joby has pivoted to the L3 Harris partnership. And from the feedback from the military, maybe there is a view that these things aren't as useful unless they're hybridized, and so on and so forth. So I think that's kind of my spiel of how I sort of think about it. I feel like they got involved with the military early on. There are a lot of people that came to Joby that came from things that the military was investing in, whether it's DARPA, NASA, things like that. So that whole, when people think about Joby and they think about the air taxi, it's like, and they don't think of it as like a defense or a government first type organization. I think you're missing a trick. I think you're missing what really is sort of behind the scenes. And as we start to think about some of the future platforms that the government seems interested in, these highly attritable, that's the buzzword, cheaper, quicker to manufacture, can be manufactured using your existing national manufacturing footprint. So, the way that things were made back in World War II, when you had Ford Motor Company was making cars and also, planes and things like that. And that extended all the way through the 80s and 90s, actually, where Ford was making satellites. General Mills was making military equipment too while they were making cereal. So I think all of this sort of brings us to the point where Joby is now, through this. And this was the first day that this was, I think, the first real clear mark that plane was there. It wasn't delivered, on paper. It was delivered in person. And it also shows that Joby's chairman, Paul Sciarra, his involvement in on the defense side. Usually you'll see him on calls and he'll take some of the defense questions. And I think, there's probably some division of labor and effort. And Paul was here at this reveal. And in his first opening remarks, he mentioned that Joe Ben had COVID. So that's why Joe Ben wasn't there. But it's just another nod for me, that like they've got real board level engagement with defense. And I think they have a true appreciation for what government involvement in, sort of developing technologies can do, because they've been beneficiaries at, whether it was before they came to Joby, as scholars or as competitors in DARPA challenges and NASA challenges and things like that, or directly through some of the funding that they got. I know I said a lot there and I rambled a little bit, but I hope that helps.
No, I mean, all of this is what's important. That's how you get, we'll just play this as, actually Paul's portion here, but, we've talked about this enough, and this is what matters, right? Is all of this work, in the background. That is the Joby S4 aircraft, but it's not a mock-up like you would see at a conference. That actually flies. That has flown with military pilots, Joby pilots as well. That's the difference, I think, about what, this is. And, also something that's really important, Joby with all of their partnerships. You don't just see Joby bragging about, and they're really never bragging, but just, promoting and thanking their partners that they work with. So the Toyotas, the Deltas, the Ubers of the world. And when you see, there's also some other articles that we can point to, but this is straight off of, Edwards Air Force Base's feed, right? This isn't something that is produced by Joby, or, they were a part of the event, but this is something where, it's not just Joby resources going towards this at all levels. This is something that, the flash forward to most recently, Joby doing their work with Superpilot out in Hawaii. That was, if you look up AFRL or any of these, government websites, they were all quite proud of what that was. So, this live stream from 2023, when Paul is there delivering the first aircraft, I think is something that is, can't be mistaken as how grave and important that this is for the company. And then since then, obviously, things have transpired into what we'll talk about a little bit later on. But the S4T, people are sleeping on what that thing is going to be, and I think it was kind of what you were alluded to. People are totally missing the forest for the trees, and focus thinking this is just for air taxis. And this is, actually, it is a purpose built and at the same time multi-purpose aviation platform. And that seems like a bunch of, word salad, but that's what they're doing. This S4 aircraft that we're looking at on this picture that Paul Sciarra delivered was fully electric. Now they've converted that to be a gas turbine hybrid that is also going to be using some very, extensive technologies in along the L3 partnership. And you start to realize that isn't, an Uber from JFK to Manhattan. This is something much bigger, and it just so happens that you can also use it for that use case. And I think maybe over time, we'll start to see maybe even a separate piece of the business wholly. Joby has never, I don't believe, officially or dubbed kind of the Joby defense side of things, but at some point, again, we'll touch on it in a bit. The advanced aircraft platforms, let's just say beyond the S4, that I'll play a little clip, or maybe we can point people to in the show notes the Joe Lonsdale interview. But Jobin did not shy away from being extremely excited, about something that Joe Lonsdale said directly to him, essentially something that is powered by hydrogen and flies extremely far or something like that. And Jobin just had this big smile and said, exactly. And I think, as we've talked about offline, there are some neat clues, some neat clues out there about what they're working on. A lot of interesting things happening up at the Pendleton Range in Oregon.
Yeah. Hey, so I love what we're doing. Like if I was just learning about Joby and was watching this, I'd sort of have this like preamble of the NASA, DARPA, early days. And then here we are sort of in this Edwards era leading into Dayton and the manufacturing and everything that was happening in Dayton. But is there anything like before we leave the sort of Edwards, any other points? I mean, I'm thinking they did recently fly, they did transition. They have had pilots, right? And those are points that I've heard you talk about before.
Yeah, in terms of at Edwards Air Force Base?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And actually, that I'm going to pull up a video here that is thank you for this reminder, because we definitely cannot miss this. And a huge shout out to Zach Reeder, now head of the flight test team at Joby, who this is about this is Edwards Air Force Base, pardon me, about some really in-depth video and just understanding, I think, even if you aren't an aerospace engineer or something, but you can just see with your own eyes and understand what's happening. But where Joby was willing to put, again, this is HD in front of your face, where they're flying around their aircraft here remotely, not a pilot on board for obvious reasons, as they are testing in particular failure modes where they turn off one of the nacelles, and then also the modifying some of the different things they do with the propulsion system, including the batteries, and the aircraft's able to fly, and it doesn't even, make a dent or an effect to the experience for the pilot, the passengers, etc. So we can just play, let me play this video here. And I think just chat on maybe some of the things that you saw or remember as highlights. I have a few that I want to highlight as well, but I will just play this video, and yeah, let's see your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think one of the important things about this flight testing regime was that it also helped them with the Dubai operation, right? So before they went to Dubai, they knew that they could handle dust and they could handle heat. And all their systems could function properly and whatever maintenance, things like that. So these military contracts and this partnership, it's so useful for everyone on both sides. And I think Joby has really milked it. Like they've gotten as much as you can expect, down to people who they've hired who come from the background, either working on base or with V-22 Ospreys, that whole culture of, working with in the defense space and with the military has sort of transitioned into their organization as well. And you think you see it in the professionalism and the pride in which how people are working, from the flight research mechanics, flight test mechanics. We've seen videos. I've seen that guy in like 3 videos. You start to feel like these people. So anyway, yeah. So I think those are some highlights for me. I always wanted to know like what else are they doing on base, and they were very kind of guarded about that, including what was going to happen at MacDill, which seemed to be where special forces, and you could start speculating about all these other things. What were your impressions like when you were watching this? I remember it was a great video when it came out. It was just like breathtaking.
Yeah, I think, well, as this is kind of schematic is showing right now, but the layers, and this is something that diving deep into some of the patents, and again, that's what is so important, to see the extent of what Joby's built, but also how sophisticated and proprietary it is. But when you see that the fly-by-wire system, but alongside of the distributed electronic system, and that's all thanks to John Wagner. They're in the power electronics team, but where they're shutting off power to their to their nacelles, to their propulsion units, they're turning off battery packs. They These are things that you don't want to have happen. They're purposefully testing for this. Obviously, to get type certified for any aircraft, you'll need that. But again, these are things that are not in the future for Joby, or that they have to, talk about in a future sense. This is something that has already happened, right? This was last year, almost, what we're a few days away from this being a year ago that they're putting out, this footage to think how much has happened, since then with, this was April 14th. We know there right at the end of the summer was when the Dubai flights happened. And, from there, it's just been flying all over Dubai, flying in unhospitable environments, I guess, as you would say. And, just to see some of the, those things to me is what's actually, the most important. There's another clip that I'm going to find here. And because I want to highlight, we can chat for a second, but, something else that was really important, I think, is listening to the pilots, the air traffic control. In this sense, obviously they're talking to the base, but I'll put the audio on for this clip in a second. But I think something that maybe that you want to touch on is when we see the extent of the work that they've been doing with the government already, as you just mentioned, that they're guarded. And you think about what happens at Edwards Air Force Base is used to test a lot of unique and different things. You start to see Joby has probably done some even more extreme testing in those environments, and just as they said, they were going to try and simulate logistics or cargo missions and things like that. So I'm just curious what you think about that, and I'm going to play a deeper clip showing this failure injection testing.
Yeah, I think that was good, for the old era. It's not, the kind of thing that anyone would want to do now, and I think they figured out. There was a RAND report that kind of started to talk a little bit about these early use cases, and I can't remember if it directly referenced Joby, but it was just basically Joby and Archer, I think, at that time, and maybe Beta was doing some things, and Reliable Robotics. So having these things around is like a golf cart, that you can just like get from one place to the other. Those kinds of use cases weren't going to be as useful, and then I think it started to trickle out that the Defense Department was interested in something that could go longer, farther. So with the current battery technology and the rate of change, wasn't going to get there. And so then, hybridization or battery fuel cell kind of stole the show. And I think, Joby was in a good position because obviously they'd been thinking about that as well. And they had invested in hydrogen, and, obviously they could spin up a gas turbine engine too. That seemed to be the easiest thing to do compared to like how they were trying to kind of build electrified flight. So, and I think the proof is in the pudding, right? Like you saw how quickly they pivoted. I think probably prepared in advance, but also for us, it seemed very dramatic to see that S4T so quickly, like in the air. and a partnership with L3 Harris. To your point about how, if when we see things, it's really late in the game, and so how do you build a partnership? How do you go out there and look at all the different options you have? Who do you want to partner with? And what can they bring to the relationship? What are all the meetings with the generals and people behind the scenes to start to figure out, like, what does the government need, or what ideas they have? All that takes time, and so here's this vertical integration. I think it can't be talked about enough. I think it allows you to pivot so quickly. It allows you to iterate on the designs and ideas you already have, but it also allows you to pivot and iterate on new things. And that's, I think, one of the most exciting parts for Joby for me. Is not just the S4. It's not just the S4T. It's what else is in the pipeline. What else are they cooking up? And if all those things come to fruition, I think now it's no longer just like this small little company doing something cool in the electric space, but now it's like an aviation juggernaut.
Yeah, and I think something also, as you mentioned there, that it's really important to understand that aviation, just by the nature of what it is, outside of Joby, any aircraft that you fly on today, whether it's commercial aircraft or private jets, whatever, the programs behind so once they become type certified, then the public, they come into our lexicon, things that we're flying around and using. But there's a lot of programs that don't make it. And I think what's also important about this work that Joby's had over time, when you see them starting to both continue to accelerate the current platform, the S4, putting out the conforming aircraft, showing pictures of it with the blade spinning, et cetera, and then you see them, let's just say, seemingly quite advanced in some other aircraft platforms or different ideas. I think this is something where said they are the aerospace juggernaut. And it was something I posted the other day, and I kind of almost had to remind myself, yes, Joby, well, and after the Blade acquisition, which was so key for the company, both short term, medium term, and long term, thinking about how in the end this company is not a startup anymore. Maybe you could argue if it's Blade makes it now a revenue generating company, but a real deal, full fledged aerospace company. This is not just this is not Jobin's original drawings that that he had in the barn and et cetera, right? This is the real deal. We're watching this aircraft fly around on Edwards Air Force Base. It's currently right now everything is active, and you'll soon see that there's some red indicators, and those are on purpose, and that is Joby testing and turning off some of these components of the aircraft. But yeah, I was really thrilled about that, and I think maybe we can kind of blend this into our next leaving Edwards. If you have anything else that you wanted to touch base on there, I want to move it into the Dayton side of things, because we've got to, if they've got this technology, they've tested it, it's getting in shape, they've got to be able to manufacture it.
Going from one airport, Edwards, to Wright-Patterson.
Exactly. Yeah. So Wright-Patterson Air Force Base out there is about 20 minutes drive from the Dayton International Airport, and also Joby's two facilities that they have, the current conforming propeller plant, and then also the 730,000 square foot facility that's just 5 minutes drive from the other facility. So this is something really is not talked about, and that footprint, it's going to grow over time. Jobin didn't touch too much on it in that interview, and so maybe we'll have some more updates upcoming, but he was very explicit to call out that facility, and understanding that it was already built, already set up, they just need to move in their equipment. And similar to Dayton, the USPS building that they took over, where they're making the conforming propeller blades, is because of their modular factory and manufacturing line that they've developed over the last 17 years themselves. And then, obviously Toyota came into the picture several years ago, but this is something that they can kind of plug and play. You're the one who always reminds us of Didier talking about regional manufacturing, but in this case, it's not going to be regional, maybe in an overseas sense, but something here in Dayton. So I'll pull up a couple, maybe an article or post on that, and curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think the so getting a lot of value out of Edwards Air Force Base, military, Then you go slide into Ohio, birthplace of the Wright brothers. There's military testing facilities, etc. And so being close to that has been really is really important. And I think the way that the government sort of, when I think about government, like government local, Ohio sort of embraced. So we're talking about defense and government. I think this is important too. Both in California too, Joby has received some financial support, whether it's for jobs training. And the same thing, they had like a $500 million package, I think, in Ohio. That was a mix of grants and tax rebates and, employee. And once you start hiring more people, you get breaks there. And you've heard about Anduril has also done the same thing in the same place. And so Ohio has been really smart and future forward in trying to revitalize manufacturing. And so Joby is doing its part in that space too. And one shout out to the Joby Reddit community. If you're interested in stuff like this, you can get access to people who are just as interested as you are and might be a few minutes or hours or days or years ahead of you in research. And so I remember at the time when Joby had announced their plant, there was a big discussion in the community, in conversation with people about like, when are they going to start building out? When are they going to expand? Are they going to build something out like Archer did? Or, how's it going to all work? And they had that postal facility. And there was someone from the Joby Reddit or Joby community at large that would go there every 2 weeks and take a picture, and everyone would talk about it for a week. And so, yeah, so, it's kind of cool that they're along this journey and learning more about the company and their plans. There's a lot of people out there who share that, and it's growing. So, yeah, so I think Dayton, has been fantastic for Joby. If you look at the quality of people they've hired there, Ohio, the Ohio State's got a great engineering program, aeronautical engineering program. All the smartest people are on the East Coast and West Coast for sure. And there's a lot of manufacturing know-how that nobody on the East Coast or West Coast really knows. And Joby's been trying to figure this out. And so to tap into that amazing talent pool and government resources in Ohio, it's going to be fantastic, I think, for the country and for the company and for aerospace.
Yeah, no, and I will. I've pulled up here just an interesting map that we can touch on. But to your point about the breadth of what's happening in Ohio, in particular around aviation, it might not be something that in the coastal communities and circles that people understand, but it's the real deal in terms of both manufacturing, but also, their focus on advanced aviation, pilots, the technologies, etc. And this is George Hank Griffiths. So he was the AFWERX, which is the Air Force's, was attached to Agility Prime, but this is out of the Air Force Research Lab. He's the chief of test and airworthiness. And this was him with Ohio State University aerospace engineering students in 23. And they also were able to fly the simulator that Joby has there at that facility. And of course, we like receipts. If you notice, I'll click back so people can look. So here's Hank right here. And then if you'll notice, here's Hank as well, and Buzzer Wilson. And these were 4 U.S. Air Force pilots that were the first uniformed personnel to fly Joby, and that was through transition. And that was via remote flight at the time. You can actually see it's the old Inceptor down here. But, such an important thing. That was in 2023. So you just see the depth and, the different threads of Joby. It's sometimes when you're learning, I think and sharing, it's hard to grasp because people think that it's it's like under the tree. They think there's just a little bit of root system, and it is extremely, extremely deep.
Travis, I love you for having all those receipts. Like I was just like blabbering about Ohio State and all this, and boom, you just pull up a tweet, and it's like Ohio State military, Joby test pilots, done.
We aim to please. We aim to please. But I think so. Anyway, let me pull back up this, and I appreciate that too. It's important, right? There's a lot of talk in the space, a lot of noise, and our goal is just to focus on the signal. People can do with it what they choose.
Facts matter.
Yes, facts and details matter. So just to kind of get back to, I think something that's also important is outside of just like, okay, Dayton, Ohio. Maybe some people aren't familiar with where Dayton is, or just kind of what that looks like in relation to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base or some of these other facilities, let's just say, that are some hidden in plain sight in and around the Dayton area, and some that others that aren't. But something that I think is really important to the Dayton story, the Dayton footprint. You see, Jobs Ohio has been leaning in, reposting, talking about Joby. They are bragging about Joby. Joby wouldn't brag themselves, but Jobs Ohio is certainly bragging on them. But in this map, so we can pull up here. So the distance between the Joby Dayton USPS building, so that's the propeller, the conforming propeller facility. And actually, if you look at my mouse, just like right here, roughly, is where the other facility is that they've purchased, the 730,000 square foot facility. But just about 20, as the crow flies, so to speak, about 20 miles from that, there's a Springfield Buckley Municipal Airport where Joby has a simulator based. That's where the National Advanced Air Mobility Center of Excellence is based. And then you see right in the middle of that, if you roughly split the difference, you have Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And then these two black dots, having fun, in the past when I posted this, but, these are AFRL labs and facilities that are located in Dayton. So again, the Air Force Research Lab. And I think it's just important for people to see, that's a very small window of space for a lot of talent, technology, and for all intents and purposes, the tip of the spear for, anything eVTOL. And then, moreover, we'll see what the S4T turns into, but I think that has the potential to be quite a unique platform. And obviously that's going to probably exist in a lower domain in terms of kind of altitude of where it would operate. But, Joby isn't going to be just, in that lower altitude, call it 10,000 and lower. They have some aircraft that will operate, probably much higher than that, or much, for the most part, they'll be operating much higher than where the S4T would be.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Travis, I sent you something in the private studio chat that just links to a post. If you could pull that up, if it's not too much trouble, I can talk to that too. So we've talked about the history, the deep partnership, the advanced sort of work that has to go in, whether it's the flight simulators or whether it's these partnerships, hustling for these grants. And I think Joby's in a different place now. And so too is the FAA. And so I posted about this in February, but these are like the little nuggets I like to post on X. I don't know who else cares about this kind of stuff too, but I think these little details matter. There you saw Chris Rushilo, the head of basically the FAA, working under the DOT. Speaking to that Ohio State kind of community. I think it was a fraternity, an aviation fraternity. So think about that. Like, what are their keggers like, right? Like, what are they talking about at their functions? But they're all in suits and ties, and you can see the pictures there. But the thing that caught my attention was how he talked about, like, so here he is, he's in front of these like young minds. And so what's he going to talk about, right? And I think that's kind of where probably they need the most help, or that's where their future lies. Those would be the kinds of things you would talk to young college students. And he listed the air traffic control system, which I think everyone agrees for 50 years, 40 years, 30 years, 20 years, we've been talking about that. And now there's a lot of momentum and funding. I think they received $12.5 billion on a $50 billion pledge. And they're starting with, all the boring stuff like upgrading copper to fiber optic and, a lot of like, I don't think a lot of the sexiest things like autonomous, flights and things like that are in the first phase, but there's clearly thinking along that line of thinking about the future airspace. The next thing he talked about was new developments within advanced air mobility. He could have said a lot of things. He could have said, I don't know, like, cheaper conventional planes or SAF fuels or all the other things that the industry has been talking about that have been incremental improvements. But he highlighted new developments and then how to start a career in aviation. And if you think about those last two elements, Joby's done a great job with its career culture, building the culture. People seem enthusiastic to work there. I don't think they're working there to make millions. Hopefully they'll all make millions out of this for all the ingenuity and innovation they'll bring into the airspace. But, really thinking about like, where are things going? And so to me, that was an interesting signal from the FAA of where the energy is going, where they want all of these bright minds to kind of start positioning their careers. And then we've seen a lot of excitement too in AST and Rocket Lab, in SpaceX. So it goes beyond aviation into aerospace and space itself. But yeah, so I think Joby's in the perfect place, right? Like, so they started off in Marina. That made a lot of sense. You want to be everyone in the room. They talked about how some of the early engineers were taking parts they were 3D printing and going to the plane. Oh, this works. It doesn't work. Let's make another one. Let's stay up all night. Like that kind of energy. And I think the flight test functionality in Concorde and probably some of the software stuff will be there. But although Joby will surprise you, they also are doing software testing in Costa Rica, which a lot of people wouldn't peg that would be there. But not only are they doing software testing there, but they bought the company Avionics, and so I think they have a really good, that leadership team has a really good handle on where the puck is moving to, and as the puck gets there, you find out Joby makes an announcement. They do have autonomous flight through Superpilot. They have been thinking about hydrogen, and not just for like 5 minutes, but for 5 years, and secretly acquiring to fly and then announcing it later. And so I think the same thing is happening with career development, with pilot training. Again, you see the same theme over of like this stuff starts years and years before. It's what's underneath the water level that is the mass, the critical mass, not what you see above it. And there's a lot of things that they haven't talked about, which I hope we'll get into, in our next couple of segments about some of those things that they haven't talked about.
Yeah, and just to talk, since we want to focus on here with Dayton, the relationship that the Dayton has just broadly with aviation, but in particular, Wright-Patterson Air Force Base and the military there. But that obviously is going to take buy-in on the government side. And you see, whether that's Greg Bowles, Ryan Naru, like everybody has been doing incredible work. And this is what pictured here. You see, this is JP Nassif, I think is how you pronounce it. But he's the Jobs Ohio president and CEO, and he's always posting about Joby, highlighting that. And, if you look, hey, I would just tell him to say it louder. He starts out this quote within this article talking about the Dayton facility announcement. As the world's leading advanced air mobility company, Joby's decision to double down in Ohio speaks to the speed at which advanced technologies can scale in our state and the powerful and collaborative environment Team Ohio and Dayton Development Coalition have built. And I think, when you look at, this is just a few comments. There's also several, there's a U.S. representative here, also a senator that was involved with this, multiple senators. So again, this was in January 7th of this year. And that was when Joby announced that they were going to visit for the second facility, the 730,000 square foot facility.
Yeah, and I think it's important to say that it's kind of across the aisle to support both Democrats and Republicans. And you don't see agreement much these days, even in defense. But from an Ohio's perspective, it seems like a state that's completely locked in and really believes that they need to change the game. And again, look at the kinds of talented companies that it's attracted, including Anduril.
Correct. And what I think also too, this is, whether we were talking about it with the simulators or just broadly this defense story, this is again a slow moving ship, right? Getting Congress people, senators involved, local governments, and then, on a local level in Dayton, but then overall from the state level, from Ohio more broadly. And these are things that have a really, really, really long tail for at least on the build up to them. And you see that Joby's, pretty far down that path. And the fact that, again, this is also something for the state in and of itself. Hiring is always, the one thing whenever people are talking about economy or measuring any type of, value to it, jobs is the one thing that's always thrown around. And so, I think when you see that Joby already has a facility there and they're ramping that team, buying another 700, well, they've already purchased the 730,000 square foot facility. We already know that there's a bunch of green space that they have rights to. And, they've said at scale, and this, for me is into the 2030s, is, being able to ramp up to 500 aircraft out of Dayton. So, yeah, this is a really big story. It's going to take still more time to fully evolve, but Joby is really knocking on the door, I think, of really showing people that they can manufacture at a scale that people aren't truly appreciating, especially based off of the work with Toyota.
Just one point on sort of what's, the iceberg under the mass underneath the water level. I think it's really important. This is not a sexy stat or observation, but when you look at Joby's marketing team, I think everyone would say like, wow, they've really upped their game. You see some of the electric skies tour, the videos about the flight mechanics and all the showing you the failure, showing you the transition, things like that. They've really improved in the last year. What you don't see is the number of people that they have in the policy area. So that's the stuff that interacts with Congress, local, opens up markets, whether it's working with Florida's Department of Transportation, California, Ohio, et cetera. They have like, by my count, I count like 12 people. They might have more. So they have 8 people that maybe in the comms marketing sort of area. And then they have like 12, and again, these aren't absolute accurate numbers, but from what I've been able to gather on LinkedIn and things like that. And so that speaks to, and they've been hiring more, in that policy space. So I think, again, that speaks to their sort of strategic vision, understanding how Washington works. These are, again, things that are long lead time things, just like the flight simulator. And so where it might not look like Joby's doing much because they don't have a section on their webpage that talks about defense, and they don't show pictures of generals with their, their stars on their shirts, and they don't show a cool picture of a full military kitted, badass looking, sort of Call of Duty type of plane. If you're going on optics, you're missing the story. You're missing what's beneath there. And I think defense contracting is extremely hard to get in there. Joby doesn't have a commercial plane yet, and yet they're pursuing defense deals. And so in order to do that, you have to really be able to show that you have the chops, you can be trusted. And I think when you go back to those AFWERX and prior to that, the DIA kind of early start days, it shows that Joby has been pursuing, this government area, not as a hobby or not as a pivot to generate revenue, but they've been pursuing this all along, from my perspective. I don't know exact dates and things like that. I wasn't in any of those meetings, but it seems like that has been a critical part, and they're committed to it, and they're not opposed to working with the Defense Department or other government agencies to be able to help deliver on missions. And at the same time, obviously, they get R&D out of it. They get some early funding. They get some early testing with pilots, things like that, and they get to fly. So really exciting what Joby is doing. All the pieces that they're putting into place, that they've been putting into place and investing in over time, hasn't shown up yet, in any contract or any specific thing. But it seems like it's moving even faster in that area, and they're investing in that space by hiring more people on the policy side.
Yeah, no, I think that's something, and they seem like such an integral part of the team, just like all the other executives. And it's nice that you actually hear from them. Something that you alluded to. We both recognize the. I think his name is mentioned in one of them, but I think he's one of the flight test mechanics. You get to on a personal level with, not just the executives, but also people who are on the ground, the pilots, the mechanics, the designers, everybody on the team is a part of this journey that we're starting to see, at least more broadly, a lot more content, seeing a lot more, I wouldn't say transparency. Joby's been quite transparent, the whole way through, but just more visibility has been crucial for that. So as we shift gears here, we've been given kind of a more of a high, some things high level, but also some things quite deep dive into the history of Joby Defense, where that started, back at the beginning with investment and work that they did with DIU, Defense Innovation Unit. They've also worked with NASA. We didn't really touch on it here. It's kind of involved with defense, but adjacent is their work with NASA on the acoustic profile and making this aircraft very quiet. That's helpful if you're trying to land in a neighborhood to bring somebody to a doctor's appointment or a sporting event, or just move them across the city. But it also is really beneficial that if you have an aircraft that could, let's say, land in the middle of the woods or on the side of a mountain like they proved in Bonnie Doon, that does it extremely quietly. Of course, that work with NASA isn't just for the commercial side, that also translates deeply into the defense side of things. But we see a marked shift from in the past. It was more behind the scenes. We didn't get to see what was going on. Not that they weren't giving information about it. You could find articles, again, posted on AFRL's website and whatnot. We saw Joby acquire X-Wing, which, for all intents and purposes, yeah, that's a long-term commercial play. But right now, as we've already seen, and I'll actually pull up this here, but Joby, in 2025 showcased Super Pilot, I think, way further than anybody realized in Hawaii, flying 7,000 plus miles on that autonomously. These are things that are all building up to what I think the next part of our conversation, and we'll spend as much time as we want on it. But things got really real when people could start to see the aircraft that the military components and capabilities that Joby somehow doesn't get credit for, which is fine. Paul Sciarra is leading that, and the proof is in the work that he's delivered with L3 Harris. And there's some neat clues out there about other things that they might be working on. And I think that is what we'll shift the conversation here and talk about the S4T, the gas turbine hybrid VTOL that Joby's working on. Well, they're building it out. L3 Harris is going to, quote unquote, missionize it. So they'll be putting all the sensors and other loadout onto that aircraft. But this is something that, we had heard about at the end of 2025. That was promised. Promises made, promises kept from Joby. They delivered that aircraft and then have shown us some pictures to it. And I'll actually pull up the post that we have to highlight someone incredibly. Phil posted off of X, shared something from Facebook. Somebody had been locally there in Marina and actually got to see the S4T and with the new fuselage. So we know that it was a recent video of this thing flying. So yeah, I'll pull up this video, but I'll let you kind of touch on what you'd like to about the S4T and set this up.
Yeah, so I think the thing that we had all expected some kind of militarized version of the S4, and then the question was whether how are they going to sort of achieve range, because the hydrogen testing was still sort of multiple years out from practicality. You touched on also too some of the challenges of, like, if you're in a defense military space, how do you deliver hydrogen, or sort of what are these small chargers. There's been a lot of energy in that space in defense tech, if you're tracking it. Even there was someone who left Archer to just start up Chariot Aviation that was just focused on these small, like, power banks that you could bring out into into a war zone and power up various drones, or in this case would be the idea would be an S4. But then Joby came out with this hybrid gas turbine technology, and I think that's been something the industry, all OEMs, are sort of talking about that now as well. But I was impressed by how quickly they were able to go from, okay, if this is the pivot we need to make for early defense contracts or utility, to be able to show a prototype. And I think the first version we saw had this, sort of like this pod underneath the S4. It just seemed like it was like a Frankenstein monster type of cut it out and put it in. But it seemed like, this was a go. They could do it. And then from there, you've now seen more recently some new designs where they have the back door is kind of replaced with a structure that has like gills, so you can kind of bring in the air that you need, or the cooling. I'm not as technical on the mechanics of like what benefits that gives you, but you can see them sort of maturing their design. And so it seems like there's an S4T platform that is missionized by L3 Harris. If you don't know much about L3 Harris, they're very, again, another one of those defense tech. It almost seems like they're part of the old school, but they're really not, like with the different things that they're doing with telecommunications, electronic warfare, I think they even have missiles and things like that. So your imagination can run wild of like, well, what could you strap on or strap into a S4 factor? And again, this speaks to the idea that like if you're going to have these attritable, hundreds or thousands of these things down the road, they need to be cheap, they need to be easy to manufacture, and you don't need to. Ideally, you don't want pilots, and this is the exciting space for Joby. Again, just like those early DARPA days or Edwards Air Force Base, the testing that Joby gets from that, serves their maybe primary client or customer, which in this case would be the defense industry. But then there's this commercial application. And I think, the vision would be that you have these production lines where they're making basically an S4, and one line can actually militarize it efficiently and, divert those units for military purposes or government purposes. That could run the gamut from like Cal Fire here in Northern California, fighting fires, rescuing people, delivering communication. I mean, we've kind of speculated a little bit about all the things when you look at all the partners Joby has, like S4, not S4, the Korean. There's a telecommunication potential where you could like beam out, like a G network to firefighters who are like stuck in these remote places where there isn't good communication. There's so many things that could come out of that S4T. I was just happy with that as their platform for a number of years, and how you could missionize it in different ways immediately with L3, but also with other partners of Joby's. But then they introduced something else, or they haven't introduced it, but we saw glimpses of something else that seemed like an entirely different platform, which spoke to Joby's potential to have multiple platforms. And again, that makes what's under the water level seem even more massive.
Yes, and I think we'll get there in just a second, but I wanted to highlight a couple things here on the S4T that I think need to be elaborated a little bit further, as much as we know about this platform at this point of time. So first things first, I think, I'm going to pull up this quote from Jason Lambert. So he's the president of ISR, so Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance at L3 Harris in particular. And so, when if people should do their research about what L3 Harris is involved with, and as you pointed it out, they're involved with doing things with their different sensor systems, et cetera, to create equipment from hand radios for soldiers and operators to rocket engines, like they were promoting the recent Artemis flight, that they had been a part of that as well, to they make missiles as well. I mean, they run the gamut. So I think that this is as you said, it's not part of the old guard necessarily, but quite entrenched and connected within the Department of War more broadly. But so this is what Jason said, and this was back at the tail end of last year. And so as you just read through, you can see a couple highlights. Is only 3 months after the announcement of the hybrid concept, Joby successfully demonstrated vertical integration of the hybrid turbine powertrain. And so I think we can just highlight one thing there, is that the S4 isn't just an eVTOL that is for commercial air taxis. It is an aviation platform, and what they have been able to do, and whether that is, as you mentioned it, kind of the more Frankenstein-y looking hydrogen version of the S4 eVTOL, that was the prototype. It also flew 561 miles, which was so remarkable. But that Joby has been able to retrofit different propulsion means of propulsion, I should say. They're still using their nacelles and electric batteries, but using the hydrogen fuel cell technology. And then in this case, with the S4T, the gas turbine, but they're able to do that without completely rewriting, the story of that aircraft. They'll feel very confident that it'll still be able to perform as different things are. You think about the S4T as we're seeing, back here in this picture, and this actually doesn't, with the most recent here with the gills on it, but you notice that the aircraft itself otherwise, is completely the same. And so Joby is going to be able to do certain upgrades and things. And as we started out this episode or show with was understanding, Joby once upon a time did have a version of this aircraft that had retractable landing gear. And, who knows where they went with that technology, or maybe they scrapped it. This is a better option, gives more flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. It's more robust. But just knowing that, the Joby Special Projects team has a deep, deep quiver of arrows that they're working with. And it was something that in the Joe Lonsdale, Joe Ben interview just on the American Optimist was Jobin was talking about Gregor and that how he was saying, and we're presuming that that's Gregor. He's talking about the top aerodynamicist on the planet, and that he himself felt that his use of AI and Joby works with several different software companies and systems. One of them just coming to the top of my head is Databricks, but things where they're able to process information through their piece of things into their design unit, their engineering unit, their aerodynamics and flight physics team, where he said that this is the tip of the spear in terms of minds. It's incredible that he's, been at Joby and worked at Joby for quite some time, and his name's all over, a multitude of the patents. But to think that he believes that AI in their system and how they're utilizing it makes him 10x more productive. And where Jobin said he's saying that from 1 month to the next. And so when you think about, over time, that what are all the things that Jobin says were, kind of filed away that he couldn't get to because he didn't have time, resources, et cetera. What other designs has he thought about, or things that he just hasn't been able to get to because they've been so focused on, the underlying business of building out the commercial side. That's where I get really excited and just think about, this is what they're telling us. Who knows what they're not telling us at this point? We haven't found out exactly what sensors they're going to put on here. Jobin elaborated a little bit in the American Optimist interview, talking about that it was for counter-UAS, for contested logistics. Also, he gave a shout out. I was thinking of you when I was listening to it about the CAL FIRE, or at least the kind of emergency services component of how you could use these aircraft. And, it was always interesting why he was out at that. He was in a sling. I guess he'd hurt his arm, but why he was out at that CAL FIRE test, they never showed what they were doing. And those are just a lot of different layers. So yeah, if you want to jump and give any more context, I'm going to also play the video that we just saw of this thing flying recently. Let me find it here. Giving away all the goods. Give me 1 second to pull this. But yeah, maybe I guess as I pulled this up too, just to start to shift the context into where we're going to go with this, the fun conclusion is, over time we've seen Joby has a platform. They're working with the defense side of the business, whether that's been both from an investment, but flying at Edwards Air Force Base, these pilots are the ones who are piloting the aircraft, and they're starting to fill in the flight test team. And Paul Sciarra, as you mentioned, has anytime there's a defense question or anything in Q&A or thing to touch on in any of the earnings call, Paul is the one who's handling and driving that piece of the business. And he has been very direct when, for instance, on a StockTwits interview that we recently posted, people have questioned Joby's interaction with the DoD, and Paul is very, very, very keeps the cards very close to the vest. But you can tell, he has, alongside the regulatory team, done some really deep work with DoD. And when you see the S4T show up, there's some neat clues that we've seen that you had highlighted in this next iteration of aircraft. But I'm going to pull up the video of the S4T flying, give any color there, and then we'll shift gears to our other friend.
Yeah, I guess I'll just start. So the S4T we talked about, there's a lot of speculation of different use cases for the military, shifting from sort of on-base support, like a golf cart that helps people move around. There's all kinds of speculation like, hey, there are a lot of different branches of the military that have people in remote places. Our nuclear defense deterrent is another example where you've got people in remote locations. And if you need to shuttle people around efficiently, those are some of the early use cases I remember hearing about. Again, not from Joby, but just pure speculation from the internet. And then I think when the energy started to shift to MacDill Air Force Base, people started looking into what's going on in MacDill and in Florida, and that was where JSOC had their command and control. And so people speculated that it would be some type of perhaps black ops or special operator type of functionality. We've seen a lot of that from the Osama bin Laden raid, where all of a sudden the government tells you that there's a new plane. If you go back to Gulf War One, there was the F-17 that no one had seen. So could Joby be a part of that history of innovation that's kept quiet? And then the Rand report started to paint a fuller picture of what the government sort of was more interested in, and how you'd need a longer range for those kinds of missions, reliability, but obviously the quiet nature of the plane. I think the heat signature, I'm not an expert on this, but I think it is pretty favorable as well. And then everything is like a composite material, right? So maybe from a radar standpoint, it helps. But the main thing being that it would be autonomous, or it could be piloted, and having that flexibility for different types of for use cases. And then the manufacturability of this, that this could be something that isn't this exquisite F-5, which has been poo-pooed, and now, sort of as a new view, there's more luster now on it as a platform. So you need both. You need attritable, low cost things. I don't know. I'm just speculating here, but let's say you go to a future where you have the range that you need and you have this quiet vertical liftoff. It seems like it would be perfect for the kind of rescue mission that we've all been, kind of tracking the last few days with the Air Force colonel who was just rescued. When you diving into the details, I don't know how up to speed everyone is on it, but there were quite a few assets that had to be destroyed. $100 million C-130 special operator planes, two of them destroyed. Some of the small little birds that they use for bringing people into the fight as well. And so, you get to a world where there are these attritable assets that can be left behind at low cost. And I think some of the early figures people have talked about, maybe like $5 million or $3 million for a Joby S4, maybe a little more, maybe about the same price for an S4T. All of a sudden you could throw 4 or 5 of these, go out there, grab someone. A couple of them could be decoys, a couple of them could be there for redundancy in case they get shot down or something happens. And now all of a sudden the profile for the mission is a little safer, fewer pilot lives, fewer special operator lives at risk. The investment that goes into that, I think everyone knows, like it's incredible, the millions of dollars that are spent to train Air Force pilots, and then to lose them to commercial, or God forbid, lose them to a mechanical failure, or through contact with the enemy, that kind of thing. And then the planes themselves. So this last mission is probably hundreds of millions of dollars. And no one thought twice about it, right? It's just like, that's the right thing to do. But to change the economics of that and to make it, maybe even more stealthy or easier for these missions to happen would be fantastic. And I think the S4T is clearly the one that plays into that space. How much of it, it's a perfect fit, or whether there needs to be continued iteration. I think Joby's got the right partner in L3Harris, for some very specific missions. And then they have that vertical engineering where they can learn. And I think some of the best things that have come out of the Defense Department have been the result of input from people on the ground, as well as quick iteration cycles where you can quickly kind of improve things. And so I think that speaks to Joby's,
Yeah, it's pretty impressive where they've gone with it. And I'm going to share something just that it's one of my kind of old school favorites for Joby. But speaking about whatever the use case, obviously drone use cases are going to evolve. It's just the nature of warfare, but also being used in our everyday lives. You see things like Zipline and the success that they've had. This technology, it might end up being kind of how GPS became a layer that everything else sat on. Drone technology and how we use it and the different form factors, I think, is still evolving. And so to that point, in terms of unique form factors, I'm going to go to something that I said is one of my favorites that doesn't get a lot of cover. But Joby, once upon a time, was at a event And if you look in the background of this video as it rolls through, it's a Langley, Aviation Robotics Center or something like this. So, everyone knows what Langley is attached to. This was a Joby, it's called the Lotus, and this was a drone. At this point, we don't know what happened with this, right? If it did end up being developed further, or if this was just a mock-up. They've done, modeling on this aircraft and I believe some testing, but you start to see, wow, what could you do with this unique thing, or like what use cases could you find with this? If this thing is light enough weight, what could you do if you then can amplify, somehow make a smaller fuel cell alongside H2 Fly, right, Joby? I mean, we'll kind of get into that here in just a second, but you could do a lot of unique things with these different form factors, and I think that's where Joby's uniquely positioned. Again, they've built a platform with the S4, but the technology, the R&D, the team, everything's vertically integrated. Jobin highlighted that again, on that Joe Lonsdale interview. They can shift and control everything. Essentially, 90+% parts are manufactured in-house, and so from a defense side of things, despite some nonsense and silliness that people have tried to attach to Joby recently about supply chain things, Joby is again the most vertically integrated eVTOL company, and moreover has been in close connection, as we've talked extensively about today, with the DoD, the military. This is not anything new, and people need to definitely look past the noise and see how important and the depth of what Joby has built alongside of the defense side of things. So without further ado, on the Lotus, we'll get into. I'll just bring up the Hunter Brook post, and we can go from there.
Hey, while you're doing that, just as a transition, I think your patent point is really important. One of the things that impressed me and attracted me to Joby was their patent portfolio, and just some of these ideas like this. And you can see some really crazy ideas and not so crazy ideas, and you can see the evolution of Joby's ideas to what they think is probably the ideal form factor for the air taxi. There was a lot of discussion around Lilium when Lilium went bankrupt, and the patent portfolio, and I think Overair as well. And Joby didn't acquire that patent portfolio, and it was, I guess some people thought it was, they missed out on it. And later you found out that some of those patent portfolios maybe didn't have as many people bidding on them. I don't know the exact nature of the bidding process, who was involved, who wasn't. But I remember hearing that like one of the patent portfolios was acquired at a really low cost, and that was trumpeted as like a successful thing. And I sort of took a different view. I sort of thought as Joby seems to have plenty of patent and sort of research level ideas in their bank, and so maybe they didn't need that. Again, I'm speculating here, but when you hear about some of the flight researchers and some of the potential from AI, like you talked about, and just in general, they have so many people. I think they have the largest workforce in the eVTOL space compared to any of their competitors. So I think the idea factory is rich and strong at Joby, and it's exciting to see them start to show a little bit more about what they're thinking. And I know we're going to talk about maybe the thing that they haven't talked about yet, and that was hinted at on the Joe Lonsdale podcast.
Yeah, and I just put up here. I appreciate the shout out, and also, but here's just one of the examples, right, about that in depth patent portfolio that Joby has built out. And when you look at who is attached to these patents, but moreover, Goodmanston, I posted a little bit ago. That is that it could also be who Jobin was referring to, alongside of Gregor, is one of the best aerodynamicists as known, and developed the Cirrus Vision Jet. And so anyway, just the amount of brain power, right? Sure, AI and these systems are helping to magnify it, but just the sheer brain power of what's behind Joby. And this patent was pretty impressive when we saw this one here. This form factor is interesting because it's maybe even different. It speaks to that there is multiple, and that's maybe more than one or two or three different designs. This picture is flipped, but you see this, it shows a passenger configuration of that aircraft. This one shows, a cargo. Sorry again that these are sideways, but you start to see just some really unique. This is the X-wing shout out, but some of the cool technologies that Joby's been working on, and after we saw the Joe Lonsdale interview, and we saw Jobin kind of for the first time really acknowledge, I think even the company more broadly acknowledge what they maybe are working on. So I feel comfortable to share this. This is something that people in the space have, anyone who's been following has known about. And so this all started on July 11th of last year, 2025. So Hunter Brook, there had been Joby aircraft November 30 Foxtrot Romeo that had been registered in the FAA registry, but we hadn't seen it show up on FlightAware, ADSB, anything. And it finally did there, as this states here, in June, at the tail end of June of 2025. And it flew for 9 hours. So at that point, obviously, the registration had shown that it wasn't an S4 by just number of occupants, number of engines that were listed. So we knew it was something different, just didn't know how different. And anything flying for 9 hours, range is always going to be such a huge part of the conversation with the eVTOL variant of whether that's Joby's S4 or anybody trying to get into the eVTOL space. You need to have some really performant batteries, a whole charging network and system, a software stack that connects the aircraft to the infrastructure itself. I don't know, kind of like Elevate OS that Joby has and GEACX. But when we saw this, we understood, okay, we have something new. And then when you see this pictures of the aircraft, you realize, okay, this is completely different, right? This is not a VTOL at all, at least from what we can see here. And we start to see something that is a very unique looking aircraft that has two engines, two nacelles placed onto the V tail, and outside of that, more or less a similar body and fuselage shape as the Cessna Grand Caravan 208Bs that they fly with X-Wing as is currently. And so, I'll click through a couple of these things. We saw inside of that this looked to be an autonomous setup. There was no cockpit per se meant for, seemed to be inhabited. And then this unique tank. And then here was some of the flight aware data that showed, this extremely long flight. And then, this was Hunter Brook showing their receipts. Whoever they sent on this mission, what a lucky person, to go scope out this hotel room to see, this incredible aircraft. And then, what we saw shortly after. So the original post was July 11th, talking about something that happened at the end of June. And then this post here is just, a couple weeks later, towards the tail end of July, where they used a different type of tracking because the aircraft, Joby turned off the visibility. It was almost like, hey guys, here's this thing. And then now we're going to put it away, but just so that it's there. And, it was tracked at a reported, unconfirmed flying for 24 hours. And then when you hear what Joe Lonsdale and Jobin spoke about and how excited they were about the interest at the Pentagon and moreover the Department of War of what capabilities they might have. And they were, they weren't making it vague about different propulsion technology or saying something. I mean, they were saying explicitly hydrogen. And so that's why I think this is such a huge part of the story. I mean, no one had this in the cards, in the SPAC days, right? Or when Joby first went public. I don't even know if Bonnie, when she ran into Joe Ben, in the Santa Cruz Mountains back in the day before, Toyota invested or JetBlue Ventures invested, had this in mind, right? An aircraft that can fly for 24 hours that you can fit, some type of sophisticated loadout, whether that's L3 Harris or, other, again, there's some neat clues out there. This was such an exciting thing back at the time, and it's only been kind of hinted at in the deeper kind of Joby nerdy circles, I guess, or on Reddit. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are now that we've seen, maybe a little bit more confirmation from Joe Ben, if not directly, certainly indirectly.
Yeah, I think your eyes can tell you what you need to know about this, which is it looks like a different platform. If it's a different platform, why would Joby be investing all this time and energy into it? Why would Hunter Brook be sending a reporter holed up in a hotel somewhere in Pendleton that just happened to be perfect line of sight to capture this? But I want to just, and again, this was like what, like a 9,000 the altitude was higher. The amount it loitered for 9 hours, and you've heard Joby occasionally use that word loitering is something that's important to the Defense Department. So I think it puts it in the defense application or defense platform kind of category for Joby, not commercial. But maybe there is some dual use capability. But then there was also, I think, another flight tracking that sort of showed that it potentially maybe even flew 24 hours. I just want to make sure I got that right.
Yeah, so I've the one that I just had pulled up. Let me zoom out here. So this was the original that was for 9 hours that we had seen here. That was in their original post, and then they made that new. I hope that I'm sharing my screen. Make sure, yeah, you can see this. So yeah, and then this one right now that's up is the that you can see that is the 24-hour flight. So yeah,
excuse me, setting that up. So just a quick step back, and we'll go step two forward. But just one quick step back. So Hunter Brook, if you're wondering, it's interesting kind of organization. So it's a hedge fund. So they're shorting, companies and investing in companies, and then they built a media arm, and it's very interesting to see what's happening in the space, like using real reporters. So the editor of the piece was Sam Koppelman, who's like a New York Times bestselling author. The person who authored it was Blake Spendley, and if you look at his bio, that's the guy who started OSINT on X and Twitter. So pretty interesting with like I think now over 1 million followers, and so there's real people behind this. And Blake had a background in the Marines and the Navy. He previously I think was in the Center for Naval Analysis. So just the people around the study of Joby, on the Hunter Brook side, sometimes people poo-poo them. Oh, they're just short sellers and they're just trying to like move markets and blah blah blah. But I kind of took it as like legitimate, and the fact that they sent reporters and they had an editor, and this wasn't just like somebody going out there with their camera, like we would. This is an organization that did some real investigative journalism here. And then, I guess like stepping into the future, you want to start having that conversation too now?
yeah, let's go for it.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts? Like, what do you think Joby can do with this, and what do you think their plans are?
Yeah, I mean, I think as again, to just reiterate, I can't tell people enough to listen to both interviews. The one it was, I guess, almost exactly a year ago between Joe Ben and Joe Lonsdale on the American Optimist show. But this one that they just put out this week was truly impressive. And I, for me, usually it's been Paul Sciarra, I think, that has, as we mentioned, has spoken most about some of the use cases or the explicit. He's taken those those parts of the conversation and discussions on earnings calls. And, this was a particular forum. And obviously, Joe Lonsdale, his fund 8VC, he's got several companies. He has Epicurious, I believe is the name of it, but that they have some really interesting technology where they can bring down, if you had like a drone swarm that was trying to attack a base or something like that, non-kinetic means to take down multiple drones at once. And they just had a new milestone and some funding, I think, recently as well. So Joe Lonsdale, is in and around that space. Obviously, his connection with the Palantir side, that was his whole thing, was getting into the defense industry, right? So I don't know how much he's into the day-to-day of Joby, but certainly, he has connections and is close enough to hit this investment where it's not just something that was a part of his portfolio. He's highlighting and celebrating this, to this extent. But when we think about Jobin talking the counter-UAS component of things, you highlighted the term loitering. I think this is going to be what this platform that we're looking at is for. It only makes sense. You would not create something that could fly so far if you plan to refuel it for other things. This thing needs to stay in the air for a long period of time. And Jobin talks about how the efficiencies of hydrogen, people still think it's, it's impossible, et cetera, but they're showing it real world application. But when you see something that can fly for 24 hours and loiter, sure, you have Predator drones and things like that, but I think there'll be some unique components, whether it's about the, as you said, maybe the heat signature, the noise signature, certainly. Maybe it, again, I'm not an aerospace engineer or anything, but when I look at this aircraft, it has the two propulsion motors that are nacelles that are attached to the V-tail, but the wing is pretty significant, and that means you want enough lift. And so that's, for me, just totally anecdotally, but I think that that's going to mean that they want this thing to have a fair amount of payload. And you just think about what you could use that for, and then when you think about what they've already done with the X-Wing attached to the Grand Caravan platforms, and they've already talked about doing logistics. What if you could also have something that could fly and carry, a loadout and put into some contested logistics area, et cetera, fly for 24 hours, land, whoever it's delivering it to takes its gear, and then the thing can fly away, because they've already shown that this aircraft cannot just fly, but it can take off and land, on its own. Joby has shown that. So anyway, I think that's where I get really excited, is that this is this whole other thing, again, unofficial, but what this platform is going to turn into, I think becomes very, very significant. And in particular, because where they've already shown it to exist at, this aircraft has flown, more recently than this photo that we're showing here. That's what they're showing us right on radar. So what's behind the scenes, I think, some neat clues.
Do you think you could zoom in on the plane? Because I think there's some features about it that might be missed sort of in the broad, like especially how thin the propellers are.
Yeah.
Some of those things that might be something interesting for the audience.
Sure. So yeah, hopefully, this is a little bit more visible, and yeah, we can kind of break this down a little bit further. The aircraft, right? What do we know? We don't know much. We know that the FAA registration matches. We knew that said that there would be two engines. We can see those, visibly here in the photo, as you mentioned. These are very unique. These blades are definitely not what are on the S4. These are both much more thin, but also just looks like a different shape, or what they're doing with it. Seems very low profile. Again, I would presume that's probably something around the acoustic profile. And something that I thought was also interesting is that these cones on the S4, they are a full cone that sits over top of the front of the nacelle. And if you kind of, let's see if I can get this, that's as close as it'll get us, but you can kind of see that this is actually looks kind of more of like a turbine vent, right? Like an intake of some sort. And so that's really curious, right? To see what's cooking, on that front. And when I first saw this picture, man, we were so excited. We didn't know, what to make of it. And something that was really helpful, because we can see the team around it, and it looks like it's a fairly confined space. And Hunter Brook also got some satellite footage, so you can see the footprint of this hangar that they, Joby put up this hangar. This was not there in existence before. You can see that from the satellite footage. But from these people around it, you can start to see the height of the aircraft. Obviously, perspective could be missed, but it seems as if this individual has, for instance, some wire or conduit in his hand. Seems to be right next to where there's some type of outlet to charge, take data, more than likely probably take data off of the aircraft, since this is hydrogen. It could be, it could be fuel cell, who knows? But it seems like they're right next to it, so you can start to get some proportions of not just the aircraft, but in particular, this really, really curious thing which was the tank. And so when I put this into Grok and did some breakdowns of it, I looked at it and said, okay, look at the workers around, and try and get a size estimate of this tank. And then I went back and looked at Joby's previous announcement, where they flew the 561 miles on the hydrogen that, as you said, kind of has like the Frankenstein thing underneath the S4. And they had said that was a 40 kilogram tank that had flown. 40 kilogram there of hydrogen had flown that distance, 561. So if you do the math, it actually ends up this. So because when we saw this photo, we only knew it flew 9 hours, right, at the beginning. And once you did the math of calculating it using the other aircraft as a baseline, it said it was right around 24 hours. So that was another really unique thing that we can, again, there's some grain of salt in that analysis from Grok, but I thought that was a really cool thing. Is before it was validated, that was everything seems to line up, right? Even though we don't know a lot of specifics about the aircraft, we can start to deduce some, really in-depth things. So, anything else particular you wanted to highlight about the aircraft?
Yeah, I thought you made some observations when we were talking months ago about this around the length of the wing. I don't know. I don't want to steal your thunder, but you talked about it's a different. Like I think in the first few seconds when you saw this, you started to try and fit this into the profile of the S4 because it has the same sort of V-shaped tail. And then you realize, oh my gosh, but wait, it's got two propellers facing forward. Oh, it's not VTOL. Oh, it seems like it has this hydrogen front end. There's X-wing already in the background by the hangar that they constructed, so on and so forth. And it quickly became obvious that this is an entirely different platform using elements of Joby's know-how, but clearly for a completely different mission.
Yes, and I think again, there's some neat clues as to what that might be. Joby, they have a deep list of partners that they've worked with on their commercial business. On the defense side, L3 Harris is who we've heard about as missionizing aircraft, and we'll see if this is going to be involving them, this aircraft here, or where else that this is going to go for Joby. I think something else that we to highlight, not maybe explicitly about this aircraft, the aircraft in and of itself, but was what is around it. And as you mentioned, this is an X-wing trailer. And of course, that is their mobile command center. We've seen this in a few different schematics and or pictures. We don't have the schematics of or seeing like what's on the inside of that, but we have seen other of the super pilot team, their command center, that really just looks kind of like a home flight simulator, right? A whole bunch of screens in front of you, and then just somebody to oversee it. But what was neat about this was we saw, and this was, again, back last year, even though, recently there had been some buzz, people trying to, maybe literally create buzz out of nothing, talking about working with Starlink. But this was the first time that I think all of us poured over every pixel of these photos for quite some time. But you can actually see where Joby was already using Starlink. It sits right on top of the X-wing trailer. Back in 2025. And there's a couple other pictures that show that as well. And so when you think about the autonomous technology outside of, whoa, this is a completely different platform, as you said, like this is definitely not VTOL. You can almost 100% see that those nacelles do not tilt, and that wouldn't make sense for them to tilt. So, this is a completely different aircraft. This is using a completely different means of propulsion energy. But then this was also when we realized, oh, wow, the X-Wing partnership was very real, because we heard about this before really some of the more developed and the reforpack exercises that Joby worked on out in Hawaii, et cetera. This was the first iteration where we saw, outside of the S4 platform itself, oh, wow, the X-Wing technology isn't just a one-size-fits-all. This is going to be useful in a lot of different platforms and for different mission types. And then to also lean in, and you mentioned it, it's something that has not really been highlighted. There's been a few, if you look in the shipping logs, since people are so fixated on shipping logs for Joby, but missing the point, you'll see that SK Telecom and Joby have sent equipment back and forth over the years, and SK Telecom operationally was a part of that, but they have also invested and still hold that. So you start to see that with autonomy, obviously there's going to be, Joby's working with NVIDIA, and they have the Thor platform that's on board that aircraft. So tip of the spear in terms of the autonomy chips. Jobin also highlighted that the crucial piece of that when he's speaking to Joe Lonsdale. But you're going to need some type of very sophisticated communication means. And Joby had put out recently, well, it was put out about Joby that one of those FCC alerts. This wasn't the one talking about the seems to be the EIPP in New York, but this was something about the actually. Shout out to Catsy, one of the ASTS space mob, who's an extremely smart individual and looking like deep into the weeds, where Joby has an FCC license. Keep me honest, I want to say it was to operate up to 70,000 feet. It was something, and so that requires sophisticated communication, right? You're not sending an aircraft up there if you don't, there can't be a millisecond lag, right? I mean, this is a tip of the spear, technology, and especially here because we see it, kind of taken apart a bit, or them doing some work on the aircraft. Maybe it doesn't have its full once. Maybe we never have this officially unveiled. That's what we've kind of talked about that offline, but I think that's why it's so important that people pay attention to what we do have. This might be the only photos that we get to see of this aircraft outside of maybe other things, some neat clues, but we'll see where it goes from here. Do you have, we can kind of wrap up this, but to kind of tie in everything together, the goal was to do a deep dive. There's so much, we can't cover it all in one session. But, here as we, it took 2 hours and we barely scratched the surface. That just gives you, indicator of the level of detail. And, again, this isn't just us talking for people listening. Thank you again for listening. But, there are receipts. This due diligence is out there. You can check out either of our X channels. You have the website, Let's Talk Joby. It's a resource for you. You can see the timeline of how long this Joby story has been developing. That's not a bad thing. That is a good thing. They have, as Jobin highlighted, they have both a deep and a wide grasp on how they have implemented their vertical integration into their company. And that just takes time, right? It's like we talked about the simulators. That is a long, 5-6 year process and longer. So, as we put all that together, curious, some parting thoughts on Joby Defense, what we've seen, kind of past, current, and then where we're going to in the future as we look at this, aircraft 30 Foxtrot Romeo.
Yeah, my takeaway is just, if you've been looking at Joby just through the lens of the S14, if for some reason you don't like that it's white and it looks smaller than some of the other OEMs, commercial air taxi aircraft, you're really missing the story. You're not really going deep enough to understand how much opportunity is in front of them from everything that we talked about, whether it's taking that S4 and turning it into an S4T and missionizing it with L. Harris, or whether it's some of the patent work that, that speaks to some of the deep technology insights they have and thinking that they've done, an iteration of design, and then all the way through what we just talked about, entirely different, clearly an entirely different platform. So I would just compel people who are interested in learning more about the space to think about that and set your, sort of Call of Duty biases aside. If you're looking at actual product that ships, that flies, that works. And then just maybe longer term, I think it's really interesting the time that we're in now. So, we talked about the air rescue mission that was successfully completed at high cost, but man, every penny of that worth it to save that pilot's life and bring him back home, and to reinforce that we leave no one behind. But then you think about the potential for loitering, and whether that's surveillance, whether that's for communication, establishing like a mesh network. Your mind can run wild. Maybe there's bombs in there, maybe there's missiles, maybe there's who knows what. But what's really interesting to me is just the defense tech space is growing so rapidly right now. So there seems to be an insatiable demand for what Joby is offering, which is deep partnership with the military that goes back perhaps a decade or more. When you go back to the early DARPA days, things like that. And then a company that, has military people involved, whether it's on the policy side, helping sort of to open doors to where there's need, and solving some really tough problems that some of the other defense contracting primes either don't have time for, it might be too small potatoes, they don't have the software chops, they don't have the future thinking aerospace, like limitless, like what could we do with a new form factor. But more importantly, there seems to be momentum around a $1.5 trillion defense budget, which just sounds astronomical, right? But it seems very real. And so I'm kind of optimistic that Joby is in the right place at the right time. They didn't just show up at the right time, and they didn't just show up with like a backpack and a laptop ready to figure out how to do business with the government, but that they've been working at this for a really long time behind the scenes, typical Joby fashion. We'll tell you about something when we're really, 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 really confident that we have something. I think this is just speaks to that they seem to be farther along than most people realize, and they're not talking about it. I hope they'll talk about it soon. I'm glad we had an opportunity to talk about it, and yeah, it's super exciting, in terms of like the possibility for Joby to be more than the air taxi. Now, having said all that, it's clear their focus is on that. Their focus is on scaling manufacturing of the S4, of EIP. A lot of that is also policy related. I think they and the entire industry, Archer, Whisk, Beta, they all have done an amazing job to push this up the hill and to get the government to be more comfortable with the idea of air taxi, electrical, whether it's hybrid, et cetera. So a lot of good things are happening in this space, and it's an exciting time to be tracking Joby for sure.
Well said. I can't add anything further there. If you have anything else, please add. I'm going to close it out here just with Jobin. It was a post that I put up, and this is from the Joe Lonsdale interview, but this was just a really telling part of the interview, and it's in and around future technologies, Joby's work with the defense side of the business, hydrogen in particular. This is a crucial. These 58 seconds are I think tell you quite a bit about the business. This is the minute elevator pitch. He touches on all things about vertical integration, what they're doing, I believe. So anyway, that's how I will like to close. So if you have anything else, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Yeah, the only thing I'd say is, sorry, you're going to play audio? I forgot. I'll stay quiet while you're doing. Are you playing audio?
Yeah, I'll go for it, and I'll play the video afterwards.
Okay, I was just going to answer one question that came up in chat. Chasing Waterfalls 648 asked about any new contracts to speak of, and I was just going to sort of riff on that. There definitely seems to be two upcoming. They've talked about two demos. Like one, I think they referenced sort of one would be sort of in a Joby marina or someplace that Joby has its operations, and that would be the early demonstration for contracts in the government space. And then there would be a second that would be what I assumed was like on base or somewhere else that would be for government contracts. So those two things they've talked about for this year. No new contracts. AFWERX seems like it's being sunsetted or transitioned into the logistics kind of route, and Joby has flown missions there in Hawaii and done things like that. But there have been no new contracts that I'm aware of that have been announced by the government or any agency. And then one last thing is Paul Sciarra on one of the earnings calls. There was a question around that loosely, and he talked about it as they are working with different agencies. And to me, that was like multiple. And so we know from the early Edwards, there was the Marines and the Navy and the Air Force. And so if there were other entities, 3-letter agencies maybe could be involved. I'm just speculating here, but nothing specific. And I'll let you add on to that.
Yeah, I think no specific contracts that they've publicly talked about or anything yet, but I think you highlighted something, and I don't. It's become kind of a buzzword thing, or I think maybe fixated on the number piece of it. It's important fact that you brought up the 1.5 trillion for the defense budget. That there's so much involved with that and earmarked, and there's so much of a process behind it that it's a bit of a, I think at times, a disservice about, who knows what level of it we'll hear about to some extent. There's a lot of wiggle room when you have 1.5 trillion, right? Things go to places where it doesn't get talked about, or et cetera. And so that's what I think is going to start to unfold a bit, probably with the Joby defense side, is they obviously have another platform that they seem to be testing, for hydrogen. That's a long way off, or at least a further time scale for hydrogen for commercial use. But certainly for the military applications, that seems to be the aircraft that was flying for 24 hours. That's who would need that. That there's, significant partnership. And again, maybe L3 Harris is also working with them outside of the S4T, also in this other, November 30 Foxtrot Romeo. Maybe it's somebody else, right? Who knows? It'll be interesting to see if we hear more about this aircraft. I mean, Jobin was talking about how whichever one of the aerodynamicists on the team, had all these different ideas of. We showed the autonomous aircraft they already have the patent for, that was recently, talked about at the end of last year. So there is so much underneath, I think. And so one particular contract or whatnot, we might hear about it sometime, but you can kind of see, the signs are there, so to speak, about what's cooking.
You had to work in, the signs are there.
Yes, the signs are there. All right, so I am going to just play this, and then we can close out after this video. Just a quick close to this show. But this is Jobin talking to Joe Lonsdale on the American Optimist podcast from this week, and this is about the future technologies that they're working on. And the most important part of the clip, it's just a minute here, 58 seconds, is the last little exchange between the two. Definitely something to pay attention.
When you're talking right now, I think a lot of people are picturing a Joby that has a fuel cell attached to it. Yep. But you're actually talking also about other types of aircraft that are potentially even longer distance.
What we built is what I believe to be the world's most vertically integrated aviation company. So this is from design to testing to manufacturing to operations across the full stack, and also the full width. So we're building everything from the autonomy computers to the battery systems to the motors to the airframe, the propellers, the propulsion systems, like everything on the aircraft, or the vast, more than 90% of the components on the aircraft are designed and manufactured in-house.
But this is not just like an eVTOL craft necessarily. It could also be some other kind of airplane that can go really far with hydrogen.
Exactly.
But we're not announcing that yet. We're just teasing people. When you're talking right now, I think a lot of people are picturing a.
So yeah, that little chuckle at the end, and Jobin is definitely plays close to the vest with the how he speaks about things. But that was a really telling exchange, and I think from as we've said, it just seems like some neat clues are out there, and it's good to see that them promoting this further, pushing it out there. Hopefully we learn at least high level about it, even if the rest has to stay kind of behind the scenes for the Department of War angle. But yeah, very very exciting to have these things cooking, to highlight the extensive work that Joby's had with the DIU, AFWERX, AFRL, all branches of the military, NASA. This isn't a startup anymore. I'm saying it right here on this show. It's no longer a startup. This is a full-fledged aerospace company. They have shown at this point of time a level of prudence with how they spent capital, how they've actually performed with operations, have they scaled out manufacturing, built out their teams that are not just focused on the air taxi piece of the business, but whether that's Paul Sciarra, Greg Bowles, Ryan Muir, anybody on the regulatory side, anybody getting them into these conversations around defense. I think that is something that we will see in the future. As I said earlier, it might be that Joby Defense is as bigger. I mean, that's always hyperbole to say, but this is not a, side project. Jobin has mentioned, even in the last Joe Lonsdale interview, this is what he thinks about at night, right? You love that quote. This is happening. It's happening much faster than I think people realize. H2Fly said that they have a lot in store for this year. So the hydrogen angle of the business that people, I think, discredit, I don't even think they give it any chance of being viable. It could, become materially viable. And that's where, 1.5 trillion in a defense budget is maybe less relevant than somebody buying $150 million worth of, new platform of aircraft, or, whatever that looks like. That is what Joby is going to be able to unlock because of the relationships, the amount of time, the amount of work they've already done at Edwards, the connections that they have throughout the politics of it, behind the brass, dealing with the heads of the government to make this actually, as you said, like, this has to be a sexy use case for them. Right there, the F-35 wouldn't have happened without somebody saying, hey, we can do, all these different things with this fighter jet that might be really expensive and difficult to maintain, or, all these other things that the plane have, but that's what those guys need. And that's what they're asking for. And, as Jason Lambert is the president of ISR for L3Harris, we put up his quote. They are looking for something that's dual use. This is something that already has a manufacturing line that doesn't need to be stood up. They're just missionizing the aircraft. So exciting to see what we have in store for Joby Defense. But as we've said it, we'll shout it from the rooftops and won't stop. This is a real side of the business. This is not an afterthought. And there's a lot more in store that I think people might not understand or realize, and we'll be excited to see it all happen. And again, that's completely separate from EIPP and type certification. I mean, we just talked for over 2 hours and didn't even really need to touch on that piece of things. So the Joby story continues to be deeper, more robust than anybody believes. Maybe I'm not even bullish enough on this company. And give you the last word.
I would just say we probably needed about another 15 minutes just to talk about H2Fly. I know people are concerned about hydrogen. You may have seen the Hindenburg and thought, oh my God, it's at risk of blowing up. And the Hindenburg didn't light up because of an explosion. There was a small fire that started on the fabric around the Hindenburg, that big airship that you see the black and white footage of it burning. And then also, I think hydrogen has been poo-pooed a little bit. The Toyota had a hydrogen car, and getting fuel for hydrogen fuel was difficult, blah, blah, blah. But hydrogen is a completely different thing. Again, I won't go into all the details, but if you're interested, Joby acquired H2Fly. We touched on it briefly, but they're doing some amazing things. They're actually ramping hiring. So it's a growth area for them, even though it's like a slow boat to success. And they've kind of mastered how to contain, liquid hydrogen, how to keep it inside a tank. And then they're kind of evolving their technology to be able to more efficiently pump that hydrogen into generating the fuel, the power that you need. And you basically think of it as like an organization. It's like deep, multiple steps into commercializing hydrogen for aviation, and now having this sort of like testing arm if there's some type of defense work that could be used. Hydrogen is also not super hard to make, like it is for you and me, but if you're in a military setting, you could have a device that basically makes hydrogen on base or on forward base or etc. that could fuel this. You could also truck it in and things like that. So hydrogen's a really exciting topic. That's why Joe Ben has had that quote about waking up in the morning and being the thing he's most excited about. And when he talks about the specific fuel, the specific power, and all the sort of dynamics around it, there's a lot there. So just definitely check out H2Fly to see what they're up to, and you might get more confident about a future in aviation and hydrogen.
Yeah, and it's just for that anecdote about the Hindenburg or hydrogen or questions that people have. So actually, and I was trying to pull it up here. In the first episode of the Joe Lonsdale Joben interview, Joe Lonsdale asks him that question, and Joben talks about it, and it has something to do with, I guess, something about the density, something around that. So, I'll try and pull the clip, but the density of hydrogen is that it evaporates very quickly so that it doesn't become flammable. I guess that was my takeaway from what he said. So it's just, and there's so many things in life that, the Hindenburg just looks, the footage that we've seen of that is seared into your memory, and you make all sorts of assumptions about it. But it's great to hear, that assumption is incorrect. And even more so if there's a market opportunity for Joben and hydrogen aviation that people were scared of because they thought, the boogeyman that was the Hindenburg might not have actually been the boogeyman for the reason that they thought. And so, as we get things moving into the future, it's kind of crazy, but this hydrogen aviation might be the thing that makes Joby, takes Joby to the next level beyond the S4 itself.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe in a few years we'll be talking about new platforms that are commercial based, and we'll be telling the same story about how the roots of it were in research with the DoD or DOW and working with government agencies that were more flexible to deploy advanced technologies like that. Then eventually, just like all the stuff in NASA kind of filtered down to commercial products, it seems like hydrogen could be potentially one of those technologies. And Joby would be at the front row of use cases and working in really difficult environments with it. So could, help open up pathways for hydrogen to make it into commercial aviation. And the amount of unlock that would produce is 5 shows in terms of new form factors for, commercial flights to Europe and other places that would be on completely different types of planes that would look different from the kinds of planes that are suited for, jet fuel.
Yeah, we'll see what the future holds. I think we'll probably get some updates in and around something with DOW this year. Presumably, there's all in and around EIPP. There's probably some things they could leverage as well. But I think we don't talk about the stock of the company or anything specific there, but just from the broader investment perspectives or thinking about this company moving forward. I think everything that you're talking about here for hydrogen, just as we said, as people who have been invested in the company, but looking at it for a very long time, right? And that's our conviction has grown because they continue to deliver, they continue to produce. But when you think about right now, people just are starting to get around to the idea of a flying car or an air taxi, and they thought that was still the Jetsons, right? They thought that was a cartoon from decades ago, and now that's becoming real. And for us, it's kind of funny, right? People who followed this for some time, you still talk to people and they have no idea. They look at you like you're an alien from outer space. That this is something that is very tangible right now. And speaking about the defense side of the business, and in particular to the hydrogen side, whether that ends up being, it'll always start defense and then go to commercial. It's just like how the S4 platform started, and the testing, the simulators we talked about, the pilots. And so looking forward, if nobody is valuing this company as something, if hydrogen gets involved, it's either you're increasing the range and payload, probably both. And so that's, as you touched on with H2 Fly, no, it is not in anybody's bingo card that Joby can come out with a small, let's call it maybe a super mid-size private jet style. Could be for commercially, however they execute and use it. Maybe it's part of their Uber Air powered by Joby, another offering that you can fly further, and that's that form factor. Who knows? Like, people are not understanding and appreciating, I think, where Joby is going for the future. And as an investor in the company, outside of them executing on the air taxis, outside of them executing on the certification process and moving it as fast and as far as they can up to this point and been transparent about it, completely outside of that business, there's a whole nother aspect of, again, this is not a startup, of this aerospace company that people do not respect or at least don't appreciate. But over time, this is going to be, a game changer for the long, whatever the investment happens in the next year or two, but we're talking 10 plus years. That's the opportunity that sits here with Joby. It's not just to make a couple eVTOLs that Uber's flying from JFK to Manhattan.
Yeah. I mean, you could argue right now, Joby has more platforms on the defense government side. And that's kind of exciting. It's great to have their irons in multiple fires.
Yes. Yeah. They, continue to play 3D chess, and it's exciting to see what, if these platforms, as they get more publicly unveiled or officially acknowledged, will be extremely exciting for the story. And again, the backdrop of all that for the rest of this year and the next is the exciting work of the EIPP process in Dubai. We spoke on that a little bit. That the, talk about the Defense Department being involved because of the what's happening in Iran, but the construction, there was some reporting that that the construction at Dubai continues. So it had stopped for, I guess at the beginning of the activities there in the conflict, but then now it's back on track. So, you have all these exciting things happening in 2026. On top of it, this almost, unrecognized and quiet side of the Joby defense business. So with that, let's close it out. Hopefully insightful. Is good to talk about these things again, to look back at over time, like, oh wow, this is even, this is more robust than we had thought about as we were kind of prepping for this episode. Appreciate you as always, eVTOL fan. I mean, this was kind of spurned by some neat clues that you found. And that's why we really wanted to highlight Joby Defense for everybody. Hopefully they learned, you guys learned something. We always do, as kind of rehashes things in the memory and reinstills some of the conviction, right? Don't look at the stock price day to day. You'll drive yourself crazy, whether that's Joby or anything. What's important to do this deep due diligence, find out what aircraft are flying, who are the players involved. eVTOL fan, you were talking about who are the people behind the reporting, right? Talking about Hunter Brook. This layer of information, this is fun and exciting for us as a hobby and topic that we follow, but this is real deal, real world aviation company that's being built right in front of our eyes. So with that all said, happy Easter. Have a good rest of the weekend to everybody. eVTOL fan, you're the best. Thanks for everything. Shout out to, I know he was in here earlier. I didn't get to shout out, but our guy Mac is recovering. I'm always contributing a ton, and everybody else here. Phil is involved. He got the video for the S4Ts. Yeah, hope to have another conversation real soon, and maybe we'll hear more about a contract or an announcement from Joby.
Sounds good. Let's do this again soon.
Have a good one, everybody. See you.
Take care.